speech, I am going to tell you about the Indian Wars. The Indian Wars actually date back as far as 1812, but I will be focusing more on the ones that happened towards the end of the 1800s. The Indian Wars was actually a very cruel and pointless fight that actually consisted of many different skirmishes between the Indians and Native and white Americans. It really started by the selfish lusts of the American white man wanting more land that really belonged to the Indians. There was a common belief back then called the Manifest Destiny, which stated that the United States, was destined by God to be a nation, and therefore the Americans could do what they wanted to make it into the nation that they wanted. This led to the American Removal Act of 1830 and the Indian Wars. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 allowed the U.S. government to remove Americans from their homeland as they pleased, most of the time in very cruel ways.
Is this Native Americans or?
Yes,
American.
Indians. Sometimes they were forced to preservations in long lines tied together with chains and forced to walk hundreds of miles in that way. This was before settlement in the West happened, so the Indians in the West were still free. But soon, Americans and their greed for more land pushed into the West, forcing even those Indians out. And those Indians fought back against the white settlers. And when the government found out about this, they sent in American army to help enforce the peace, which went well. The Indians then turned on the soldiers, and the soldiers fought back. This led to many massacres of the Indians, and hate between the two sides only grew worse. From all the fighting emerged Indian chiefs like Geronimo and Chief Joseph. Geronimo was an Apache Indian whose family was cruelly murdered by the American troops. From that time on, he became a warrior with his only desire being to avenge his murdered family. He spent many years in a small band of Apache warriors, including at one point a chief named Mangus Coloradus. Mangus Coloradus was cruelly beheaded after having already surrendered to American troops. Then his head was boiled and sent to a doctor to be looked at. This infuriated Geronimo even more, and he set out to cause as much damage as he possibly could to the American soldiers. A few years later, he did surrender to the government on the promise that the government would supply him with good land and cattle and a good home, which the government shockingly broke. After the government broke their promise, he quickly escaped the reservation and joined up with a small band of Apache warriors to try and cause even more damage to the American settlers and troops. He was finally captured and lived on a reservation for the rest of his life. Chief Joseph made possibly one of the most famous tactical retreats in all of history. And what did he get for it? None other than reservation life in the U.S. When he realized that he, and likely his whole tribe, would be captured and potentially massacred by American troops, he decided it would be best to retreat to Canada. He was planning this with a couple other Indian chiefs. But when the other Indian chiefs decided it would be best to outright fight the Americans, he had to make a call and immediately retreat to Canada, which he did, and he got most of the way too. But he finally did give in to the ensuing Americans, who caught up to him, and they were marched back to reservations, were sent in unheated rail cars. Mind you, this all happened during the winter. In the end, 150 of Chief Joseph's tribe were killed by the retreat, and the rest were forced to reservation lives for the rest of their lives. keep in mind, reservations back then were more like prisons and not like they are today. Well, I hope I have given you a bit of an understanding of the Indian Wars and how cruel and pointless they really were. Thanks for tuning in.
Thank you.
So I was supposed to ask, what emotion did you feel
I
when
felt
listening?
anger. Well, anger that, you know, the bad, they were so twisted the story that
Yeah.
the Indians were horrible and the white men were innocent angels.
I would say sad. It makes me sad, and it's tragic
Yeah.
that those things happened in history, but they did. And
Yeah.
And I also
it's healthy to
sympathize.
know of it.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
do sympathize with the Indians for going and trying to kill the white men.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe they should have forgiven them, but still, I would,
It's understandable.
yeah,
Yes, it
I would
is.
feel that way